So let's continue with that post detail page now, with this slug page, which we load for a given slug. On this page, I in the end want to output the content of a selected post. So that includes a header with the title and maybe the image again, but then below that, the actual text that makes up a post. Of course, we don't have any text yet. We only have those excerpts. But in the actual post data, which we'll add in the next lectures, we will also have a rich content for every post with headings and images and maybe code snippets, and of course, a lot of just plain text. Hence, in this slug.js file, in this component, I again want to return another component which will actually take care about outputting that post content. And I'll do that here in the posts folder, in the components folder. I'll add a subfolder named post detail to make it clear that in there we have the components for a single post. And in there I'll add a post-content.js file. I will also already add a post header.js file, which will be responsible for outputting the main header data, like the main title and the image of that selected post. Now for that, we'll also need some styles, and as always, you find those attached. Attached, you do find a post content module CSS and a post header module CSS file, and you can just download them and add them in your post detail folder. Now let's start with the post content.js file. This will become a quite complex file over time, but we will start simple. We'll again start by creating our component function and exporting that as a default, as we always do. And then in here, we want to return some markup, some JSX code that renders a post. Now later, we will actually get the post content as markdown, which is text with extra annotations. You'll see it in a couple of minutes. And we'll then translate that markdown to React JSX elements. That is something we'll do later. For the moment, I'll start by adding an article element here, a standard article element, and then rendering a post header here as a first element, and then below that, the actual content. And that is what will then later translate from Markdown to actual JSX code. Now let's start with the post header though, with that post header component, for which we have this separate post header.js file. In there, again, we create our component function as we always did, and we export post header here. And then here we can return a header element, let's say, with a h1 element with the title of the post. And I do expect that I get data like the title from props. So here I do expect that I can pull data out of my props and that I get the title here and actually also the image. So then here I just output the title like that. And then below that, I want to render an image, and I'll again do that with the image component, which we therefore import from next image. So we import that component and render it just like that below the h1 tag. Actually, because of the styling, which we'll add soon, it will be rendered next to the h1 tag. So now we got that. Now the source of the image element here should be the image we're getting as an argument. And here I will expect that image is the full path to the image already. So I'll just set source equal to image, set alt equal to the title. And then we need values for width and height. And here a width of 200 and a height of 150 should work quite well. Now we will need some styles. So I'll import classes from /post-header.module.css, this CSS file which I provided to you. And with that on the header, we can add a class name of header, like that. Now that is the post header component which we use in post content. Hence we need to set the title and the image here. Now speaking of that, our post content will need some content to work. And we'll soon get that content from a real data source. Since we don't have that data source yet, I'll create a dummy post here, and we will just assume that we loaded that post. So I'll create a dummy post here, which is a JavaScript object, which will contain some dummy data, like for example a slug. And here I want to use one of the slugs I used before. Actually, I'll grab one of my dummy posts here, so a single dummy post. I'll grab that post and use that now as a dummy post in post content. Here, like this. I will get rid of the excerpt though, we don't need that here, but instead I will add a content field which will contain the actual post content. And in here I will write Markdown code. Now, in case you're not familiar with Markdown, you can of course Google it, look it up, and you'll see that there also is a cheat sheet. Markdown in the end is plain text with extra annotations. Markdown looks like this. You write text, and you can, for example, add a hash symbol in front of it to turn it into a title. You can also create lists with dashes or with numbers to have ordered lists. You can add links by putting text in square brackets and adding the link destination in parentheses thereafter, things like that. If you ever worked with GitHub and you added a README for a GitHub repository, you wrote that in Markdown. And we use Markdown here because it's less code than if we would use HTML. And it can be translated into HTML or into JSX even with third-party packages which we'll add. So here I'll add a simple Markdown text of this is a first post. And the interesting thing is that this is plain text with this extra hash annotation, turning this into a title in Markdown's world. And the goal is now to translate this string from Markdown into JSX, which we'll do in the next lecture. Before we do that, let's set the title and image of the post header though. For this, here in post content, I will create an image path here, and again set up a template literal, where we dive into /images/posts, then use the slug, so dummypost.slug, and then use the actual image name, so inject dummypost.image. And it's this image path which I set as a value for the image prop on my post header, like this. And for the title, we can also set this dynamically to dummypost.title. Now for the content, we don't want to do dummypost.content because if we would see that content, but we would just output it as plain text, not translated from Markdown to JSX, and therefore that's not what we want. Still, to get started, let's start with this, and let's then go to the slug.js file in the pages post folder and output post content here. And later we'll pass in the data for the post content from inside this page. For the moment, I'll just render it like this, and I'll import post content from the proper path, therefore. And if we do all that, if you reload a single post, you see post header is not defined, because in post content, I'm using post header, but I'm not importing it. That's something we should change. I'll import post header from /post header, add that import in the post content file, and now we see this. This is not the final look I want though. I want some extra styling, and for that I did add that post content module CSS file. So I will also import classes from there and import classes from post-content.module.css. And then on this article here, set a class name of classes.content. If we save that now, that looks better. But here we see that we have this untransformed raw text. And therefore, let's now become a bit more advanced by adding functionality to translate plain Markdown text into renderable JSX code.